The ocean seems calm, but beneath its surface churn centuries of stories. Picture the waters of the Caribbean in the 17th century, an almost impossible blue, sliced by the white foam of galleons cutting across the horizon. On deck, the sun falls like a flame on the weathered faces of the sailors. The smell of salt and damp wood soaks everything, and the sails, huge and heavy, swell with a wind that does not distinguish flags. This is the stage on which the legend of the pirates was born. Men and women who refused to obey the rules of kingdoms and chose to write their own upon the sea. In those years, the oceans were bigger than we can imagine today. Maps were full of blanks and warnings. Here be monsters. Here ends the known world. Yet for thousands of sailors, that emptiness was also a promise. A promise of fortune, of adventure, of freedom. The so-called Golden Age of piracy, which stretched roughly between 1650 and 1730, was born from the chaos that followed the great colonial empires. In the holds of Spanish ships traveled tons of American silver. On the decks of English vessels, cannons pointed at anyone who tried to interrupt that flow of wealth. It was a time of conquests, but also of desperation, where men of the sea wavered between obedience and survival. Before we go on, I'm very curious to know from where in the world and at what time you're joining tonight. I'd love to read you in the comments. Perhaps you're listening to this from a noisy city, or maybe from a quiet place by the sea. Whatever the case, I invite you to let yourself be carried by the waves of time and sail with me through one of the most fascinating and dangerous eras in history. Because being a pirate, more than a profession, was an act of defiance. Imagine a sailor without a homeland, tired of seeing kings and merchants divide up the gold of the New World, while he barely had bread to survive. Imagine that one night, in a tavern full of smoke and songs, someone tells him about a ship that sails without a flag, with a crew that shares the loot in equal parts. There are no masters, no imposed captains, only an agreement among equals. That was the spark that lit the fire of piracy. What began as a desperate attempt to escape misery soon became a way of life. The chronicles of the time describe a sea where law scarcely existed. Among the reefs of the Caribbean, merchant ships were easy prey, and the coasts teemed with islands that served as natural hideouts. Every voyage could end in a fortune or in a coral grave. Pirates did not attack only out of greed. They did it also because they knew no kingdom would take them back. They lived outside the system, and in that marginality, they found a strange sense of justice. Runaway slaves were welcomed as equals, deserters found refuge, and women, few but determined, showed that freedom could have many faces. The seas of that age were a board on which the European powers played endless games of ambition. Spain protected its routes with armed galleons. England sent privateers with royal licenses to plunder in its name. France and Holland lurked in silence, waiting for their chance. In the midst of that game, the true pirates arose, those who no longer obeyed any power. They were the outlaws of the ocean, the men without a king. Sometimes they attacked enemies of their former nation, at others, their own compatriots. But above all, they attacked the established order. Aboard their ships, life was ruled by a rhythm as savage as it was poetic. The sea dictated the days. Calm at dawn, fear in the storms, hope at the sight of a sail on the horizon. The nights, lit by the stars, were the only time they could feel masters of their fate. There, in the immensity, far from land and its laws, a kind of freedom was born that very few men had known. A freedom that carried a high price: persecution, illness, loneliness, and almost always a violent death. But they accepted it, because deep down, they knew the sea was the only impartial judge they had left. Today, when we think of pirates, our minds fill with romantic images: black flags, treasure chests, rum, and endless adventures. But behind that fantasy there existed a real world, harsh and fascinating, where each wave could bring glory or doom. The sea was a refuge, but also a sentence. And it was precisely in that ownerless space that piracy found its reason for being, a place beyond the law, but also beyond fear. The waters grow darker as we advance. In the distance, a ship flies a strange flag, half symbol, half warning. Soon we will understand where those men who chose to obey no one came from, and how the empires, unwittingly, gave them the tools to become legend. The wind shifts and the sails creak. Beyond the horizon await the wars of empires and the origin of those first mariners who traded their fate for that of the open sea. The 17th century was a time when the world seemed to expand every day. Trade routes spread like veins of gold across the oceans, and the European empires competed to dominate every port, every island, every current of wind. Spain, with its galleons laden with silver and spices, had amassed immense power thanks to the riches of America. England, France, and Holland looked with envy at that flow of treasures crossing the Atlantic towards Seville and Cadiz. At sea, political rivalries turned into battles of fire and smoke, and what on land was diplomacy, in the waters was settled with cannons. In that turbulent setting, privateers became a useful tool for kings. A privateer was not exactly a pirate. He was a raider with official permission. They carried a letter of marque, a document authorizing them to attack enemy ships in the name of their nation. In return, they handed a portion of the loot to the crown. It was, in essence, a form of private war disguised as patriotism. For years, England encouraged men like Francis Drake or Henry Morgan to set upon the Spanish fleets. Each sunk galleon was a blow to the enemy's pride and an injection of gold into the kingdom's coffers. But times changed. Peace treaties between the powers ended many of those wars, and with them, the business of privateering. Overnight, thousands of armed and experienced sailors found themselves without work, without a flag, and without purpose. The kings had signed peace, but hunger stayed aboard. Demobilized privateers, used to the dangerous life and the quick prize, could not return to the discipline of the ports, nor to the paltry wages of the merchant navy. And so, when the royal permit expired, many simply kept doing the same thing, only now on their own account. It was then that the privateer turned into a pirate, not by a sudden revelation, but out of need, habit, and a growing sense that loyalty to the king no longer meant anything. What had once been just war became crime, and what had once been honor turned into treason. Those men, accustomed to sailing under a national flag, began to hoist others, black flags, with skulls and symbols of death, not as a sign of evil, but as a warning. It was their way of telling the world that they no longer answered to anyone. The conditions of the Caribbean favored their expansion. Unlike the North Atlantic, the climate was warm, the passages short, and the refuges abundant. Dozens of small islands offered perfect hideouts, secluded bays, caves, inlets protected by reefs. Smuggling flourished, and the European colonies, still weak and scattered, were fertile ground for pirate raids. Colonial governors, often corrupt or indebted, turned a blind eye in exchange for a share of the loot. Thus, piracy went from being an isolated threat to a parallel economic system, sustained by the silence of those who profited from it. To grasp it better, you must imagine the magnitude of the wealth that moved through those seas. Each year, the treasure fleets carried tons of precious metals, cocoa, sugar, silks, porcelains, and tobacco. A single galleon could hold in its holds the equivalent of millions in gold. That vision, a slow, heavy ship loaded to the brim, was an irresistible temptation for men without work and hungry for fortune. And they were not few. It is estimated that, at its height, more than 2,000 pirates plied the Caribbean at the same time, spread among dozens of independent crews, with no law but their will. Even so, reducing it all to greed would be unfair. Many of those men, former sailors, freed slaves, indigenous people, or peasants driven from their lands, found at sea something the world had never offered them: equality. Aboard a pirate ship, the loot was shared among all. The captain's voice was worth the same as the cook's when it came to deciding the course. That fraternity, though born of necessity, represented a kind of floating democracy in an age ruled by kings and immovable hierarchies. Over time, the line between privateer and pirate grew blurry. Some alternated between both worlds, changing flags with the political wind. Henry Morgan, for example, began as a privateer in England's service, sacking Portobello and Panama. But his acts were so brutal that even his own government temporarily disavowed him, only to later knight him. He was the perfect reflection of an ambiguous age, in which morals depended on point of view and crime could turn into glory with a royal signature. Thus the modern pirate was born, child of imperial chaos, of hunger and of pride. Neither hero nor villain, but a man cast into the sea by circumstance. When politics closed its doors, he found his path among the waves, defying the very kingdoms that had created him. In his gaze, there was rage, but also a spark of something deeper: the desire to own his destiny, even at the cost of his life. And as the sun fell over the ports of the Caribbean, these new free sailors began to seek safe havens, places where they could drink, trade, and plan their next adventure without the risk of the noose. The sea was full of islands, and some would soon become sanctuaries for men without a homeland. In the heart of the Caribbean, where the sea seems to have neither beginning nor end, arose the places that gave piracy its soul. They were small points on the map, islands, ports, inlets, but in them beat an intense, bustling, overflowing life. For many of those men without a homeland, they were more than mere refuges. They were a way to be reborn. On the mainland, the law hunted them. In those enclaves, the law bent, dissolved among rum, music, and the smell of gunpowder. The most famous of all was, without doubt, Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas. At the dawn of the 18th century, that corner of white sands and palms became a true republic of pirates. Sailors arrived with their holds full of gold and stolen goods, and found a port where no one asked where the booty came from. The wooden houses, the taverns, and the improvised docks were the stage for a chaotic yet surprisingly functional coexistence. There were drunken sprees and brawls, yes, but also deals, exchanges, and a certain idea of community. Nassau was not the only haven. Before it, in the 17th century, Tortuga, off the coast of Haiti, had been the sanctuary of the French buccaneers, forerunners of the pirates of the Caribbean. There, among jungle-covered mountains and hidden coves, men lived by hunting, smuggling, and assaulting the Spanish galleons that passed nearby. It was a place of survivors, of rootless adventurers, where fugitives found a second chance. And further south, Port Royal in Jamaica rose as the richest and wickedest city in the world, a nickname that was no exaggeration. Port Royal was a boiling cauldron of life. The taverns never closed. The bells rang without rest. Brothels competed with temples, and the smell of rum and pitch soaked everything. Spanish, French, and English coins mingled on the gaming tables, and the streets were a parade of merchants, sailors, slaves, soldiers, and preachers. There, pirates could spend in a night what they had earned in months of danger. English chroniclers of the time wrote with scandal about its libertinism, but also with a certain fascination. Port Royal was proof that imperial order was not invincible. In these havens, pirate society found a mirror in which to see itself. There was no nobility, no military ranks, no distinction of blood. A runaway slave could become a gunner, an illiterate peasant, a captain. The sea, which made all equal under the same sun, did the same on land. In the streets of Nassau or Port Royal, power was measured by daring, not by surnames. That apparent anarchy, however, had a deep logic. Pirates needed places to repair their ships, sell the loot, buy powder, recruit men, and rest before the next strike. But those havens also played a symbolic role. They were the demonstration that a world could exist beyond kings, a society built on cooperation and mutual interest, without need of decrees or crowns. In that sense, Nassau came to be called the Republic of Pirates, a community without a flag where power changed hands as fast as the wind. Illegal trade kept the whole region alive. Pirates traded their spoils for food, weapons, or medicine with settlers, merchants, and even corrupt authorities. The borders between legal and forbidden were so thin that the very men who swore to fight piracy often ended up benefiting from it. That double standard was part of the game. And while the European powers worried about distant wars, the Caribbean became a sort of social laboratory, where freedom mixed with greed and law with chaos. But not everything was euphoria. The same factors that had allowed Nassau or Port Royal to thrive would also doom them. Disputes among captains, fragile alliances, overconfidence, and the growing attention of the European crowns began to darken their future. When trade routes once again became essential to the empires, the pirate republics ceased to be tolerated. The cannons that had pointed toward the enemies of the realm slowly turned toward those who had defied its authority. And yet, for a brief instant, in those ports overflowing with life and danger, the men of the sea achieved something that seemed impossible: to build their own order within disorder. An imperfect world, yes, but free. Their friendships were forged, pacts were sealed, and utopias were dreamed that would end up shaping the romantic image of the pirate that still accompanies us. The wind blows from the west and the sails swell again. On deck, the weathered faces prepare to set sail. Beyond the horizon await the stories of those who made that chaos a way of life, the names and faces that filled those lawless seas with legend. If we close our eyes and think of a pirate, we might see a face covered in beard, a tricorn hat, a fierce gaze, and a black flag waving behind. But the true pirates of the Golden Age were as different from one another as the waves of the sea that bore them. Each had his story, his code, his reason for defying the world. In their biographies, ambition, misery, bravery, and at times, a spark of idealism intertwine. To know them is to look straight at the human face of piracy, beyond the myth. One of the most feared was Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard. His name alone was enough to freeze sailors' blood. He stood over 6 feet tall, an imposing height for his time, and his thick beard, braided with slow-burning fuses soaked in powder, made him seem a hellish apparition when he charged into battle. But behind the terror was a strategist. Blackbeard rarely resorted to violence if fear was enough. He understood that a reputation was as useful as a well-loaded cannon. For years he sailed with his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, imposing his own law on the waters of the Atlantic and the Caribbean. Yet his career lasted only a few years. In 1718, he was surrounded by the English Navy and cut down after a fierce battle off the coast of North Carolina. They say he kept fighting even after taking several shots, and that his head was hung from the enemy ship's bowsprit as a warning. But in a way, his death made him immortal. The myth of the pirate who does not fear hell. Further south, in the waters of the Caribbean, another name rang with force: Henry Morgan. Born in Wales, he began as a privateer in England's service, attacking Spanish positions in his king's name. His campaigns were brutal: Portobello, Maracaibo, Panama. Cities sacked, burned, reduced to rubble. But his cunning and success earned him royal pardon and a noble title. He went from outlaw to knight and governor of Jamaica. Morgan embodied the perfect paradox of the age: the criminal glorified, the bandit rewarded by the power he had defied. His story shows that the line between pirate and hero was as thin as a sail's edge in the wind. But not all the names that marked that era were male. two figures stand out with a force that crosses the centuries: Anne Bonny and Mary Read. In a world where women were destined to be silent and obedient, they chose to take up a sword and live by their own rules. Anne Bonny, born in Ireland, joined the pirate Calico Jack Rackham and sailed with him disguised as a man. Her temper was feared as much as her skill with weapons. Mary Read, for her part, had grown up passing as male in order to work on ships and in armies. When both ended up in the same crew, they forged a legendary friendship. Two women hidden beneath men's clothes, fighting shoulder to shoulder with the boldest men of the sea. Their capture in 1720 marked the end of a brief but intense career. Mary died in prison. Anne vanished from the records, wrapped in mystery. But their legacy broke a boundary. They showed that freedom could also have a woman's face. And then there was Calico Jack, the dandy of the sea. His nickname came from the colored calicos he wore, always more concerned with elegance than brutality. He was neither a great strategist nor a relentless leader, but his crew and his flag went down in history. He is credited with creating the most famous symbol of piracy, the skull with two crossed cutlasses on a black field, a standard that even today represents rebellion and a life without chains. His end, however, was as theatrical as his life. Captured, tried, and hanged in Jamaica, while the women who had shared his adventure survived in his shadow. Beyond the names, piracy was a mirror of its time. In it mixed destitute sailors, escaped slaves, adventurers seeking fortune, and dreamers who preferred to die free rather than live subdued. Some, like Blackbeard, embraced violence as a means of power. Others, like Anne Bonny or Calico Jack, sought at sea a different life, a way to exist without permission. What united them was the certainty that no one would rescue them, that they had only the sea and themselves. In their exploits there is blood, but also an echo of humanity. The fame of these pirates was owed not only to the fear they inspired, but to the fascination they provoked. They were the world's outcasts, and yet in their defiance, there was something deeply seductive, the possibility of escaping an imposed fate. Perhaps that is why, centuries later, we still invoke their names as if they were still out there, sailing under the moon. The Caribbean sky turns red at dusk, and over the decks ring laughter, shouts, the clink of glasses. Among them, a group of men sign a parchment stained with rum and salt, a pact that will seal their fate and define the rules of the sea they are about to defy. Amid the chaos of the sea and the roar of cannons, the pirates built something no one expected: their own order. At first glance, it may seem contradictory that men devoted to plunder and violence had a code, a set of rules governing life aboard. But the truth is that, within that apparent anarchy, there was a surprising structure. Far from the kingdoms and the laws that had condemned them to the margins, the pirates created their own system of justice, born of experience and of the need to survive in a world without authority. The so-called pirate code was not universal, though many ships shared similar principles. Each crew drafted its own before setting sail, in assembly, with the sailors gathered under the flickering light of lanterns, signing with ink, with blood, or simply with a mark. In it they decided essential matters: how the loot would be divided, what punishments traitors would receive, how disputes would be resolved, and above all, how the captain would be chosen. Because, unlike the Royal Navy or the armies, on a pirate ship command did not come imposed from above. It was earned by vote. If the captain lost the crew's confidence, he could be deposed at any time. That was, in essence, a form of floating democracy. The division of loot was another sacred aspect of the code. Fairness was its most important principle. Each man received a share proportional to the risk assumed and to his role in the crew. The captain, though he led operations, received only a slightly larger fraction. The surgeon, the carpenter, or the gunner could earn as much as he did if they proved their worth in combat. That just distribution made men fight with more loyalty than in any imperial navy, where officers kept the glory and sailors the wounds. On a pirate ship, all were owners of their fate, and that bound them in a way no military discipline could match. Nevertheless, that freedom had clear limits. Theft among comrades, cowardice in battle, or disobedience at critical moments were punished harshly. The penalties varied, from loss of one's share of the loot to abandonment on a deserted island, the dreaded marooning. It was a form of banishment that was almost a death sentence. Even so, these punishments were not applied with arbitrary cruelty, but after deliberation. The group decided, and justice was carried out without favoritism. In a world where the laws of kingdoms served the powerful, pirate justice came closer to equality than most courts on land. The code also regulated daily life. Fights aboard were forbidden outside formal duels. Watches were scheduled. Alcohol consumption during navigation was limited, and rules were set for the distribution of food and arms. On some ships, even the wounded were compensated. A lost arm might be worth a sum of gold, a leg, a percentage of the next prize. That foresight, what we might today call social security, shows how far pirates understood the importance of protecting their own. On a ship where all depended on all, solidarity was not a virtue, it was survival. It is fascinating to think that, in the 18th century, on an ocean ruled by absolute monarchies, there existed communities of men and women who practiced primitive forms of democracy and cooperation. Of course, they were not ideal. Violence, greed, and fear were present. But within that chaos there was a genuine search for justice. Many historians have compared these pirate assemblies to the first experiences of self-government, tiny republics in miniature moving over the sea. They may have been fleeting, but they left an echo that still resounds when we think of absolute freedom. The captain, though the most visible figure, did not act as a tyrant. His authority was almost symbolic outside combat. In battle, his word was law. In calm, any man could question him. Above him there was another figure, the quartermaster, also elected by vote, charged with maintaining discipline and ensuring the code was kept. He was, in a way, the guarantor of justice aboard, the balance between power and freedom. His word could check the captain if he abused his authority. The code, therefore, was more than a set of rules. It was a moral pact. A reminder that even among outlaws there could be order, and that freedom endures only when upheld by agreement. Perhaps that was the true strength of the pirates, not their brutality, but their ability to organize without need of kings or crowns. In their small floating world, equality was not a philosophical idea, but a daily practice. Sometimes, at night, while the sea slept and the ship rocked gently, the men reviewed the clauses of their code beside a lit lamp. They did it in low voices, as if recalling a promise. Perhaps they knew that, beyond those planks of wood and those shared rules, the world was still unjust. But there, in the middle of the ocean, at least for a moment, they managed to build something that truly belonged to them. Dawn finds them in silence, with the sails ready and the horizon stretching out like a challenge. In the air, one can feel the taut calm of the days before action, when routine gives way to danger, and the sea once again puts them to the test. Life on a pirate ship was a blend of routine and constant risk, of camaraderie and exhaustion. From afar, the unfurled sails and the black flag might look like symbols of adventure, but on board, reality had another flavor, that of sweat, damp wood, and rancid food. That floating world was, in essence, a village in motion, with its own rules, its long days, and its uncertain nights, always to the rhythm of the sea. Dawn usually marked the start of the day. With the first light, the quartermaster walked the deck barking orders between yawns. The men climbed out of their hammocks, some slung between the cannons, others tied to the masts, and hurried to stow them before the sun warmed the air. The ship was scrubbed thoroughly each morning, not for looks, but for survival. In such a cramped space, filth was synonymous with disease. With buckets of salt water and rough brushes, they scoured the deck, checked the rigging, repaired the sails, and greased the pulleys. It was hard, repetitive, and necessary work. Breakfast was as simple as life itself: hard bread, ship's biscuit, and, if they were lucky, a bit of salted meat. Often the food was infested with weevils, but no one complained. Rum, mixed with water to avoid drunkenness, served as relief and disinfectant. On calm days, pirates entertained themselves by telling stories, playing dice, or carving wood. Some kept amulets or bits of rope they believed brought good luck. Others wrote, in crooked, trembling letters, small journals that time and sea would eventually erase. Living together was not always easy. More than 100 men living together, crowded, with no privacy, no space for silence. Arguments flared up over anything: a look, a card, a word misread. The pirate code forbade direct clashes on board, but tensions piled up like storms on the horizon. When rage overflowed, the captain could allow a duel on shore, hand to hand, until one fell or both gave up. Deep down, they knew unity was their greatest weapon. At sea, isolation was a synonym for death. The sea was not always kind. Storms could last for entire days, with lightning splitting the sky and waves so high it seemed the ship would be swallowed whole. In those moments, the men became pure will. They gripped the lines with bleeding fingers, bailed water with buckets, and prayed at the top of their lungs, mixing pleas with blasphemies. Many could not swim. The sea, for them, was both ally and executioner. When the storm passed and the sun returned, the silence that followed was almost sacred, as if all knew they had survived once more the fury of something greater than themselves. On calm days, the tempo slowed. The sound of the waves, the creak of the wood, and the constant thrum of the wind were the music of their existence. The sailors took turns on watch, scanning the horizon with rusty spyglasses, alert to any enemy sail or the smoke of a distant cannon. There were idle moments too, and in them, the ship transformed. The men sang tavern ballads, tuned improvised instruments, shared rum and laughter. It was their way of forgetting that every dawn could be the last. Hygiene was a luxury few could afford. Fresh water was as precious as gold, reserved for drinking or cooking, so baths were taken with salt water, weather permitting. Disease was a constant enemy. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, made gums bleed and teeth loosen. Infections spread easily, and minor wounds could become death sentences. In the worst cases, the ship's surgeon, more barber than doctor, stepped in with unsterilized knives and rum as the only anesthetic. It was brutal medicine, but effective in its starkness. Despite it all, pirate life offered something most of those men had never known on land: respect. On the ship, each had his worth, his function, his vote. No one was another's servant. That sense of belonging, of being part of a brotherhood bound by need and adventure, offset the shortages and dangers. Perhaps that is why many never wanted to abandon that existence, even knowing the end was almost always violent. At night, the ship sank into a hypnotic calm. The sea became a dark mirror, and the stars, reflected on the waves, seemed to guide the course of the men sleeping beneath them. Only the helmsman stayed awake, hands firm on the wheel and eyes fixed on the line of the horizon. In that infinite silence, the ship seemed a small world suspended between reality and dream, pushing toward an uncertain fate. Suddenly, in the distance, a whitish sail appears on the horizon. It is not a storm approaching this time, but something more alive, more dangerous, that will set every heart pounding with a mix of fear and thrill. The silence before a naval fight had something almost sacred about it. It was not the silence of calm, but of pent-up tension, the kind that precedes an inevitable storm. Aboard a pirate ship, those instants were pure electricity. The men moved with learned precision, as if danger awakened a kind of shared instinct. Orders were shouted amid the creak of ropes and the beating wind. The cannons were checked one last time, match cords lit, swords sharpened. The deck, which not long before had been a home, turned into a floating battlefield. The attack began long before the first shot. The lookouts, posted on the mainmast, were the ship's eyes. With the spyglass pressed to their faces, they could make out a sail on the horizon kilometers away. When they spotted a lone vessel, they loosed the cry that made the air tremble. "Sails off the bow!" Then, the whole crew prepared. If the enemy ship looked like a merchantman, slow and heavy, enthusiasm swelled. If it showed guns and escort, the silence grew denser. In any case, the final decision fell to the captain, who had to reckon the wind, the distance, and above all, the mettle of his men. Pirates preferred to strike at dawn or at dusk, when the low sun on the horizon blinded their prey. They were masters of deceit. They often sailed under a false flag, hoisting the ensign of some friendly nation until they were close enough. Only at the last moment, when the enemy ship had no escape, did they unfurl the black flag with skull and crossbones. That sign was no mere adornment. It was a message. It meant, surrender and you will live. Resist and you will die. Many merchant captains, upon seeing it, ordered sails lowered without a single shot. Others, braver or more foolish, answered with fire. When the cannons thundered, the sea filled with smoke and echoes. Iron shot hissed over the waves, ripping splinters from the hulls, snapping masts and smashing bodies. On deck, the air reeked of powder and blood. Pirates, however, rarely aimed to sink their foe. A ruined ship was useless. Their goal was to stop it, cripple its sails, and get close enough to board. That was the decisive moment. With grapnels and lines, they flung themselves to the assault, crossing the gap between the two ships as if it were an abyss. In the clash of battle, the ring of blades mingled with shouts and the groan of timber. Hand-to-hand combat was brutal. There were no formations nor elaborate schemes, only the direct violence of one who fights for his life. Pistols, single shot, were used at point-blank range. Afterward, they were dropped to the deck and swords, knives, and clubs took over. Each man had to trust his instinct. The captain was usually the first to cross, not only out of courage, but because his example was the only thing that kept the group's morale intact. Sometimes, it was enough to see his figure standing amid the smoke for the rest to hurl themselves after him with a roar that made the air vibrate. When the battle ended, silence returned, thick and heavy. The cannons fell quiet, the smoke thinned, and the sea, indifferent, kept rocking the wreckage. If the attack had succeeded, the prisoners were gathered on deck. Some were freed if they swore not to betray them. Others were left in boats or pressed into service. The booty, gold, spices, silks, rum, weapons, was stowed with care, and the wounded received the ship surgeon's rough attention. It was a strange moment, of euphoria and exhaustion mixed, in which the line between life and death seemed as thin as a tiller's rope. Not every raid was bloody. Often the threat alone sufficed. A captain's reputation could be more effective than his cannons. Blackbeard, for instance, preferred to avoid bloodshed. His terrifying aspect was enough for crews to surrender before a fight. Psychological warfare was one of the pirates' most fearsome weapons. In a world where fear spread faster than fire, mastering it was a form of power. After victory, the pirate ship was wrapped in a blend of jubilation and quiet. Some laughed, others cried, others slumped onto the planks, breathing the dense powder-laden air. The dead were cast to the sea with a brief prayer or a lost stare toward the horizon. No one spoke the word luck, because all knew such a thing did not exist at sea. only wind, courage, and opportunity. Once the plunder was secured and the enemy vanished among the waves, the captain ordered the helm about. In the distance, the crew picked out the outline of a familiar island, a haven to rest, heal, and celebrate. Soon the roar of the guns would be replaced by laughter, music, and rum. The sea, once again, kept silent, as if accepting its role as eternal witness. The air on deck smells of powder, sweat, and salt. The battle is over. The men, spent, lean against the masts while the enemy ship drifts away or lies silent, empty and beaten. This is the moment all await, the reward for the risk, the division of the loot. In the distance, gulls wheel over the wreckage, but aboard the pirate ship a different mood prevails, a mix of relief, expectation, and restrained greed. The blood has not yet dried on the wood, and yet nervous laughter, jokes, and promises are already heard. Death, for an instant, seems forgotten. The captain gives the order to gather the treasure. Chests, sacks, barrels, and crates pass from hand to hand until they pile up in the center of the deck. Gold, jewels, cloth, weapons, rum, sugar, tobacco. Everything that might hold value is brought there under the blazing sun. The quartermaster, tasked with guaranteeing the fairness of the division, oversees the process closely. No one must hide anything. The rules are clear. He who steals from the crew will be punished without mercy. In that instant, all are equal before fortune. The sharing of the booty was one of the most important rituals of pirate life. It was not only about money, but about respect, trust, and keeping harmony aboard. According to the code, the captain received 2 shares of the total, the quartermaster 1.5, and the rest of the men 1 share each. The surgeon, if there was one, could receive an additional compensation for his work in battle. The wounded were given an extra sum, proportional to the severity of the injury. A lost arm could equal 600 pieces of 8, a leg, 800. No one was left destitute. It was a way to ensure that, even in such a dangerous trade, risk had its reward. Once the division ended, the mood changed completely. Coins jingled in pockets, rum passed from hand to hand, and songs began to bubble up as if the sea itself dictated them. Sometimes, the ship moored at a nearby island to celebrate the victory. Bonfires lit the night, laughter mixed with the sound of improvised drums, and bottles thumped on the sand. For a few hours, fear vanished. They had survived, and that, more than the gold, was reason enough to toast. Even so, not all was fellowship. Greed could turn joy into distrust in a matter of minutes. One suspicious glance, a word misread, was enough to tighten the air. Some captains knew how to rein in those emotions. Others, weaker or more arrogant, lost command before an inflamed crew. At sea, authority was as fragile as a wet rope. That is why the quartermaster played an essential role. He reminded all that the loot was worth nothing if the crew broke apart. Beyond the material gain, the division held a symbolic meaning. It was the confirmation of a pact. All had risked their lives. All had a right to their share. In an age when inequality was the rule, pirates practiced, unknowingly, a rudimentary form of social justice. There were no titles, no inheritances, no lineages, only merit and loyalty counted. That idea, simple but powerful, gave them a cohesion that not even royal navies could match. With gold in their hands and rum in their blood, some dreamed of leaving the sea. "One last voyage," they said, "and I'll retire for good." But few kept their promise. Fortune, once tasted, was addictive. The gleam of metal, the murmur of the waves, the rush of combat, all that formed a cycle that kept them trapped. In port, they spent their shares as quickly as they had earned them. Taverns, gambling, women, fleeting luxuries that vanished before the next dawn. When the money ran out, and it always ran out, only one option remained: to set sail again. Sometimes the plunder was not limited to gold or goods. Among the remains of a ship one might find letters, charts, journals, or instruments of navigation, objects that told stories. Some believed they saw in them the trail of a hidden treasure, a promise buried under the sand of a far-off island. Those legends, fed by imagination and desire, would be the seed of the myths that centuries later would fill books and films. But in that moment, only the present existed. The men drank, laughed, sang, and little by little, the sound of the sea once again overpowered human voices. Under the flicker of torches, the golden coins shone like stars. No one thought of tomorrow. Tomorrow, for pirates, was always uncertain. Dawn finds the ship anchored off a quiet island. The sails, still smudged with smoke, lie motionless. On deck, some sleep beside their weapons. Others watch the horizon, where the sea seems to hide secrets more precious than gold. Among the wind's murmurs, someone mentions a name, a story, a rumor that speaks of buried treasures and maps marked with an X. The fire still crackles on the damp sand, and on the beach the empty chests from the last raid are stacked. The men rest, exhausted, their gaze lost in the embers. Some, however, do not sleep. They play with their coins, make them gleam between their fingers, and one of them, perhaps the youngest, asks whether it wouldn't be better to hide a portion of the loot, bury it somewhere safe, away from the other's eyes. The silence that follows is brief, but loaded with meaning. All have heard tales of hidden treasures, buried under the moon, sealed with oaths. Those stories float over the sea like a perfume that never fades. The myth of pirate treasure is, without doubt, one of the most powerful images that era has left behind. Wooden chests brimming with gold, old maps marked with an X, secret islands guarded by skeletons. Yet the reality was less romantic. Most pirates buried nothing. They spent their gains as fast as they got them. Gold was fleeting, a spark that lit their existence but did not sustain it. They lived with the urgency of those who know time is short, and few thought of the future. The sea was their bank, rum their treasure, freedom their only wealth. And even so, by sheer repetition, the tales of hidden hoards ended up taking on a life of their own. The origin of the legend is attributed, in part, to Captain William Kidd, a Scottish mariner who sailed under the English flag in the late 17th century. Kidd was accused of piracy after capturing a ship laden with silk, gold, and porcelain. When the authorities pursued him, rumors spread that he had buried part of his loot on some island off America's east coast, near Long Island. That mere supposition was enough to spark the collective imagination. Treasure hunters began to dig up entire beaches, convinced that under the sand lay the fortune of the legendary captain. Kidd was hanged in 1701, his body displayed in an iron gibbet as a warning, but his myth had already set sail for immortality. From then on, stories of buried chests multiplied. People spoke of hidden treasures in the Bahamas, in Cuba, on the coasts of Florida, even in remote corners of the Indian Ocean. Some claimed to have found clues, fragments of charts, old coins, mysterious inscriptions. None of that evidence withstood serious scrutiny, but in a world where the sea was still a realm of mysteries, truth and fantasy blended easily. Sailors fed the myth by spinning yarns by the fire, between swigs of rum, exaggerating every detail until the tale became legend. What was fascinating about these stories was not their truth, but what they represented. Deep down, the buried treasure symbolized more than gold. It was the promise of a second chance, of a possible future. For pirates, men who lived between life and death, the idea of hiding their fortune had an almost spiritual sense. It was to leave a trace, to ensure that, in some way, something of them would outlast time. Perhaps they knew their names would end up forgotten or cursed, but a chest under the earth could be their epitaph, their secret legacy. Literature did the rest. In the 19th century, adventure novels transformed pirates into romantic heroes and gave the myth its final form. Authors like Robert Louis Stevenson, with Treasure Island, turned the X into a universal symbol of adventure. Fiction took the scattered fragments of history and wove them with imagination. Coded maps, cursed captains, islands lost in tropical seas. Reality was buried beneath the charm of fable. Since then, the figure of the pirate has been forever linked to treasure hunting, as if his entire life were a metaphor for that eternal pursuit of something unattainable. And perhaps it was. Because a pirate's true treasure was not measured in coins or jewels, but in the unrepeatable sensation of defying the world. Each voyage, each boarding, each night under the stars was a victory against routine, against an imposed fate. Gold could be lost, ships could sink, but the experience of having lived free, even for a moment, was a prize no one could strip from them. Over time, tales of buried treasure continued to feed the imagination of entire generations. Modern seekers have squandered fortunes trying to find real proof of those hidden chests. But the sea, ever discreet, has known how to keep its secrets. Perhaps the treasures existed, or perhaps what remains hidden is not gold, but the invisible footprints of the men who once dared to defy the laws of the known world. The breeze blows again from the east and the fire slowly dies. On the sand, footprints are erased by the tide. The sea, silent witness to so many stories, carries them off once more, while on the horizon rises the silhouette of a fleet that does not sail to trade, but to hunt. Dawn no longer brings promises of freedom, but omens of pursuit. The waters of the Caribbean, which for decades were a refuge for men without a flag, begin to fill with warships. The European powers, tired of seeing their commerce plundered and their colonies threatened, decide the time has come to end piracy. England, France, and Spain, once irreconcilable rivals, find a common enemy in those whom they had used, tolerated, or ignored for years. The time of free pirates draws to a close. It all began with a simple word: order. As trade routes solidified and colonies grew, the empires needed stability. The wars of privateering had ended, and the same sailors who had once served the kings were now seen as a threat to the system. Piracy, which for decades had been a safety valve for political and economic chaos, suddenly became an obstacle to the new era of global commerce. Kings wanted safe seas, merchants wanted stable profits, and pirates represented the antithesis of both. England was the first to make a move. In 1717, King George I issued a general amnesty. Any pirate who surrendered within a year would receive a royal pardon. It was a tempting offer for many. Some, tired of living hunted, took the deal. Others, distrustful, saw it as a trap. Among those who decided to submit was Captain Benjamin Hornigold, one of the founders of the so-called Republic of Pirates in Nassau. But not all followed his example. Among those who refused were men like Charles Vane and Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard. They still believed the sea should have no master. The Crown's response was relentless. Entire fleets were sent to the Caribbean with orders to exterminate. Pirate hunters, some former privateers, others mere mercenaries, ranged the seas in search of prey. Nassau, that sanctuary of freedom, was taken by the English Navy in 1718. The ships anchored in its bay were seized or sunk, and its inhabitants scattered. Those who did not die in combat were hanged at the docks, their bodies dangling as a warning. The message was clear: the age of piracy was over. The most famous fate was Blackbeard's. In November 1718, he was ambushed off the coast of North Carolina by Lieutenant Robert Maynard. The battle that followed was short and brutal. Witnesses say Blackbeard took more than 20 sword wounds and 5 gunshots before he fell. His head was hung from the bowsprit of the victorious ship, and his body cast into the sea. The image of the feared captain, turned trophy, symbolized the fall of an entire generation. But even dead, Blackbeard achieved what he most desired: to become immortal in the memory of those who feared him. The persecution was not limited to the Caribbean. In the Indian Ocean and off the coasts of Africa, pirates were hunted mercilessly as well. In 1720, the capture of Calico Jack, alongside Anne Bonny and Mary Red, marked another turning point. The trial was public, almost theatrical. European newspapers relished the words of the two women who defied the court with a dignity that surprised everyone. Mary died in prison, Anne disappeared without a trace. That proceeding served as an exemplary warning. The romanticism of piracy was beginning to dissolve under the weight of the law. By 1725, the Caribbean had changed completely. The great captains were dead, imprisoned, or retired. The pirate ships still at sea could be counted on the fingers of one hand. Some survivors turned to smuggling. Others entered the official navies that had once pursued them. The seas, once a stage of rebellion, became patrolled routes, disciplined, predictable. The wind still blew, the waves still broke, but the spirit that had defied them faded slowly. And yet, though bodies were hanged and black flags destroyed, the story survived. In ports, in taverns, on coasts where the sea pounds hard, old sailors kept telling the exploits of those men and women who lived without a master. Each exaggerated tale, each rumor of a ghost ship or a lost treasure, kept alive the flame the empires tried to douse. Because the sea, in its silence, keeps better than anyone the voices of those who defied it. One night, in a Jamaican port, an old man raises his glass of rum and looks to the horizon. He says that still, on stormy days, you can see the silhouette of a ship sailing without a flag, with ragged sails and a figurehead draped in seaweed. Some laugh, others fall silent. No one knows if it is true or only the echo of a memory. But all feel a shiver at the thought that perhaps pirates never vanished entirely, that their spirit keeps sailing, hidden in the mist. And while the sea returns to calm and the empires celebrate their victory, a new story begins to form on land, a story that will transform the former villains into legend. The sea had been left without pirates, but not without their stories. When the last mast of the Black Flag sank beneath the waves, a new life began for those men and women, the immortal life of myth. The empires erased them from the maps, but could not erase them from memory. From mouth to mouth, from port to port, pirate tales outlasted the passing decades, transforming bit by bit. The terror they once inspired turned to fascination, and crime to romanticism. What fear could not destroy, imagination turned into legend. By the mid-18th century, old sailors were still spinning yarns in taverns. They exaggerated exploits, added ghosts, sea monsters, and impossible treasures. Children listened, eyes wide, dreaming of ships cutting bewitched seas and captains who faced death without blinking. Those oral tales, told between laughter and swigs of rum, were the seed of a new narrative that no longer belonged to history, but to myth. The figure of the pirate, once feared, began to be seen as a symbol of rebellion, as an indomitable spirit that refused to disappear. The 19th century, with its taste for exotic adventures, set about giving that myth literary form. European writers, fascinated by the sea and the freedom it represented, turned the pirate into a romantic hero. Robert Louis Stevenson, with Treasure Island, fixed forever the image of the peg-legged captain, parrot on shoulder, and map marked with an X. Other authors followed in his wake, and soon piracy ceased to be a dark episode to become a stage of fantasy, where violence dissolved into adventure and raids were swapped for dreams of gold and freedom. Literature was not the only agent of change. In an increasingly industrialized, regulated, predictable world, the pirate represented a longing for a time without borders. He was the symbol of the man who had lived outside the law, but also outside the system, forced labor and blind obedience. The idea of a crew that governed by consensus, that split the loot fairly and recognized the worth of each individual resonated strongly in a Europe beginning to speak of rights, revolutions, and liberty. Thus, unwittingly, the former outlaws of the sea became living metaphors for an absolute freedom no one could attain anymore. Art reinforced that vision. Paintings, songs, plays, and later, films gave faces to the pirates of the collective imagination. Cinema, especially in the 20th century, immortalized them with gleaming swords, defiant smiles, and music that turned every raid into a dance. Hollywood took the sea's rawness and wrapped it in romance. Pirates no longer smelled of sweat and powder, but of adventure and longing. That process erased many historical truths, but it also kept their echo alive, reminding us that even the fiercest rebellion can become a myth that inspires. Behind every sugar-coated version, however, a question persisted. Why do we keep admiring those who broke every rule? Perhaps because deep down, we recognize in them something that belongs to us. Pirates did not obey, did not settle, did not ask permission to exist. They lived with the intensity of those who know every dawn may be the last. Their challenge to authority, though born of hunger or injustice, embodies a human impulse as old as the sea, the desire to be master of one's own fate. As the centuries passed, historians tried to separate myth from reality. They studied documents, trials, logbooks, letters. They discovered that many of the supposed monsters were ordinary sailors, victims of a system that had abandoned them. And though history corrected the excesses of legend, it could not erase it. Because truth, however precise, never has the strength of a dream. And pirates, more than historical figures, became sailing dreams, metaphors of the impossible. Today, their symbols live on. The black flag, the parrot on the shoulder, the buried chest. They are fragments of a collective memory that refuses to die. Pirates are now part of our culture, but also of something more intimate. The fantasy of escape, of breaking with the established, of launching into the sea without looking back. Each generation reinvents them in its own way, gives them a new face, but the spirit is the same, that of the human being who chooses freedom, even knowing it will cost a life. Somewhere in the world, perhaps before a screen or in the pages of a book, someone hears the murmur of the waves again and feels the same pull those sailors felt centuries ago. Because there are stories that need not be real to be true. The sea, eternal and patient, remains there, breathing under the moon. And though its waters are now dominated by safe routes and merchant ships, it still keeps, in its depths, the echoes of those who once defied everything. And perhaps that is why, when the wind blows with a certain melancholy, some swear they hear among the waves the whisper of an ancient vow, one that speaks of freedom, of memory, and of a horizon that never ends. The sea never forgets. It can erase footprints in the sand, sink ships, and swallow names, but it keeps in its murmur a memory that belongs to no one. There, beneath the waves, mingle the stories of the men who defied it and the voices of those who dared live without a master. Pirates vanished centuries ago, but their spirit keeps sailing in the currents, as if the ocean refused to let them go entirely. Every time a sail swells with wind or a storm shakes the horizon, the sea seems to remember. Their legacy, though diffuse, remains present in culture and in the collective imagination. Pirates left more than wrecks or rusted coins. They left an idea. The idea that freedom, however fleeting, is worth the risk. That notion, so simple and yet so powerful, has survived the centuries. In sea shanties, in tavern tales, in films and books that still reinvent their feats today, the same emotion that powered their voyages resounds. It is the echo of a world in which rules could be broken, where the marginalized made their own law, and where life, though short, was lived intensely. In a way, pirates were the first modern symbols of rebellion. In a time when authority seemed unbreakable, they proved it was possible to build a community based on equality and consensus. They were not heroes, but neither mere villains. They were men and women who, driven by need or despair, turned injustice into defiance. Their ships were little floating republics, laboratories of freedom in a world ruled by kings and borders. And though those republics sank, the idea that held them afloat survived, traveling in collective memory like an undercurrent. The 21st century, with its technology and headlong pace, has also made pirates its own, but in other forms. In music, in video games, in theme parks, even in fashion, their image continues to fascinate. The pirate is no longer a plunderer, but a figure of independence, a symbol of boundless adventure and resistance to control. Perhaps in a world where everything seems watched and calculated, his image reminds us of the possibility of escape, of living on the margins, even if only for an imagined instant. But beyond the cliches and black flags printed on t-shirts, something deeper persists. Something that belongs not to commerce or entertainment, but to the very essence of the human, the search for meaning. Pirates, in their apparent chaos, embodied a question that still accompanies us. What does it mean to be free? Is freedom the absence of rules or the ability to choose one's own? They chose the former and paid the highest price. We, centuries later, keep debating the latter. Perhaps that is why their story does not fade, because it speaks not only of the past, but also of us. The sea, silent witness, remains the guardian of that memory. Its currents have scattered the remains of pirate ships, but have also preserved them as metaphors. Every wave that breaks on the shore carries a fragment of that era. The creak of timbers, the echo of cannons, the murmur of songs sung under the moon. The marine archaeologists who now explore the ocean floors seek not only treasure, but fragments of a way of understanding life, traces of a humanity that refused to obey. And when one stops to listen to the sea, truly listen, there is something in its voice that sounds familiar. Perhaps it is the breathing of all who crossed it with neither map nor destination. Or perhaps the reflection of a desire that never entirely dies, to leave solid ground and trust the horizon. Pirates did it with their ships. We do it with our ideas, with our dreams, with the small rebellions that still keep us alive. Thus, the echo of the sea is not only an evocation of the past, but a constant call toward the unknown. It is the reminder that, though time turns men into legend, there will always be those who hear that call and feel, if only for a moment, the urge to set sail. The wind blows softly, and the horizon turns a deep blue. The black flag no longer flies, but the spirit that held it still beats, scattered among the waves. And while the sea continues its endless dance, it seems to whisper a truth pirates knew better than anyone: that no chain can bind the desire for freedom, and that the ocean, that vast mirror of every human dream, always keeps room for a new voyage. We have sailed together across ancient seas, through stories of courage, ambition, and freedom. Perhaps now, while the sound of the sea still echoes in your mind, you wonder what you would have done under that black flag. If you wish, tell me in the comments. I'll love reading you when the next dawn awakens. Until then, let the waves lull you and let the journey continue in your dreams. Good night.